You're crouched behind a fallen tree, and your hands won't stop shaking. It's not the cold. 30 meters away, a group of figures moves through the mist, upright, broad-shouldered, carrying spears you don't recognize. They're not like you. Their brows are heavier. Their chests are thicker. And for the first time in your short, brutal life, you understand something your ancestors never had to face. You are not the only kind of human on this earth. Not yet. Anyway, right now in your world, there's only one species of human left. You, us, Homo sapiens. But rewind the clock 100,000 years, and that's not even close to true. Back then, at least 7 different human species were walking the planet at the same time. Different bodies, different brains, different ways of surviving. And today, only one of them is still standing here to tell the story. So what happened to the other 6? For decades, the answer felt simple. We were smarter. We were faster. We won, they lost, end of story. It's the kind of explanation that lets you sleep easily at night. Clean, comfortable, familiar, even, because it's the same story every playground bully tells himself. But here's what scientists actually found when they started digging deeper into bones, caves, and ancient DNA. The truth is messier. It's stranger. And in some cases, it's a lot darker than we were just better. Let's start with the one you probably heard of, the Neanderthals. Picture this. You're a Neanderthal hunter, 60,000 years ago, somewhere in what's now France. Your body is built like a linebacker. Thick bones, powerful muscles, a rib cage shaped like a barrel to trap heat in the brutal cold of an ice age winter. Your brain, by the way, is actually slightly bigger than a modern human's. You're not some grunting brute. You bury your dead. You make tools. You might even paint on cave walls. For over 300,000 years, your people have survived ice ages that would kill most animals outright. Then, around 45,000 years ago, something new shows up, a leaner, taller, strange-looking human, moving in bigger groups, carrying tools you've never seen, thinner spear points, thrown weapons, symbols carved into bone. They call themselves Homo sapiens. And within a few thousand years, your people are gone. For a long time, the assumption was war. We killed them. Simple as that. But here's what scientists actually found when they cracked open the Neanderthal genome in 2010. Almost every person alive today who isn't of pure sub-Saharan African descent carries Neanderthal DNA. Somewhere between 1 and 4% of your genome, if you're reading this, might have come directly from them. That's not the genetic signature of a species wiped out in a massacre. That's the signature of a species that got absorbed, interbred, folded into us, generation after generation, until there weren't enough pure Neanderthals left to call us separate people anymore. Think about what that actually means. Somewhere, 45,000 years ago, a Neanderthal woman and a Homo sapiens man had a child together, or the reverse. That child grew up in one world, or the other, maybe neither. That's not the ending of a war movie. That's something far more intimate and far more unsettling, happening quietly in the background of human history. But interbreeding alone doesn't explain the collapse. Some researchers now think the real killer wasn't spears. It was numbers. Homo sapiens groups may have simply outbred and outpopulated the Neanderthals, spreading across the landscape faster, using resources more efficiently, pushing Neanderthal groups into smaller and smaller pockets until, one by one, those small groups blinked out, not conquered, just quietly crowded out of existence. And that's the first hook you need to sit with, because it changes the whole story. This wasn't one dramatic war that ended 6 other species. It was 6 different disappearances, 6 different mysteries, and some of them are far stranger than anything you were taught in school. Take the Denisovans. We didn't even know they existed until 2010. Not from a skeleton, not from a skull, from a single finger bone and a couple of teeth, found in a cold, damp cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. That's it. That's almost the entire physical fossil record we have of an entire human species. And yet, genetically, they're everywhere. Imagine being a scientist holding that finger bone, running the DNA, and realizing you're not looking at a Neanderthal and you're not looking at a modern human. You're looking at something else entirely. A third kind of human, unknown to science, hiding in the genetic shadows the whole time. Here's where it gets even stranger. Populations in modern Papua New Guinea, Australia, and parts of Southeast Asia carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. Tibetans carry a specific Denisovan gene that helps them survive at extreme high altitude, letting their blood function properly in air so thin it would leave most people gasping and dizzy within minutes. Somewhere in the deep past, a Denisovan and a Homo sapiens had a child, and that child's descendants ended up breathing easy on the roof of the world thousands of years later. We don't know what Denisovans looked like. We don't know how they lived. We don't have a single reconstructed face. An entire human species, walking the earth for hundreds of thousands of years, and almost everything we know about them comes from what they left inside us, not around us. Inside us. That should make you pause. How many other human groups existed that we'll never even find a finger bone from? How much of us is actually leftover pieces of them, quietly humming away in ourselves, with nobody left to remember where it came from? Now here's hook number 2. The one that reframes everything you thought you understood walking into this video. You probably assumed extinction meant disappearance. Gone. Erased. But for at least 2 of these 6 species, extinction didn't mean disappearing. It meant dissolving into us. Their bodies stopped existing as separate populations, but their DNA didn't die. It just changed address. It's still walking around today, in your blood, in your lungs, in the way certain populations process altitude, cold, or disease. In a very real sense, some of these extinct humans aren't extinct at all. They're just no longer walking on their own 2 feet. But not every story ends that way. Some of the other disappearances are far more brutal and far more mysterious than a slow genetic merger. Let's talk about the Hobbits of Flores. In 2003, on a remote Indonesian island called Flores, archaeologists dug up something that shouldn't have existed. A tiny human skeleton, barely 3.5 feet tall, with a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's. At first, some scientists assumed it must be a diseased modern human, some kind of pathological dwarfism. But the more bones they found, the clearer it became. This wasn't a sick individual. This was an entire species, Homo floresiensis, a separate branch of the human family tree, isolated on one island for hundreds of thousands of years, shrinking generation after generation in a process called island dwarfism, the same evolutionary pressure that produces tiny elephants and giant rats on isolated islands with limited resources. Now, picture living as one of them. You're an adult, fully grown, and you stand shorter than most 10-year-olds today. Your island is small. Your world is small. Predators like giant Komodo dragons stalk the same forest you hunt in. Every single day is a negotiation with an environment that could kill you in seconds. And here's the part that made headlines around the world. The Hobbits of Flores may have still been alive as recently as 50,000 years ago, right around the time Homo sapiens was spreading through the same region of Southeast Asia. That means, for a window of time, modern humans and a 3.5-foot-tall separate human species may have shared the same island, possibly even seen each other, possibly even fought over the same caves, the same water, the same game. Local Flores folklore, completely independent of any archaeological knowledge, describes small, hairy, forest-dwelling people called the Abu-Gogo, who supposedly lived alongside human settlers and eventually disappeared. Coincidence? Ancient memory encoded into oral tradition? Scientists are still arguing about it. But here's what they actually found in the layers of ash and sediment on Flores. Evidence of a massive volcanic eruption right around the time the hobbits vanished from the fossil record. Maybe it wasn't us. Maybe it was the island itself that killed them. Or maybe it was both. This is where you have to sit with an uncomfortable question. If a group of modern humans arrived on an island already inhabited by a smaller, physically weaker human species, and resources were suddenly scarce because of a volcanic disaster, what do you think would happen? Cooperation or competition? History, both ancient and painfully recent, tends to answer that question the same way, over and over again. Let's move to a mystery that's even harder to explain. Homo Naledi. In 2013, cavers exploring a system called Rising Star, deep beneath the ground in South Africa, squeezed through a passage so narrow that only unusually thin researchers could fit through it. At the bottom, in near total darkness, they found bones, hundreds of them, belonging to a previously unknown human species with a brain roughly a third the size of yours, but with surprisingly human-like hands and feet. Here's the part that broke a lot of assumptions in paleoanthropology. The bones weren't washed into that deep chamber by floods or dragged there by predators. The pattern of deposits strongly suggests something almost unthinkable for a species with such a small brain: deliberate, repeated visits into pitch-black cave systems to place bodies of the dead. Sit with that for a second. A creature with a brain a third the size of yours, navigating through absolute darkness, likely using controlled fire, to carry the bodies of its dead deep underground, over and over again, generation after generation. That's not mindless instinct. That looks a lot like ritual. It looks a lot like grief. For over a century, scientists assumed that big brains were the prerequisite for complex behavior like burial, meaning, and ritual. Homo Naledi shattered that assumption completely. Brain size, it turns out, might not be the whole story of what makes something behave like us. And Homo Naledi may have overlapped in time with early Homo sapiens in southern Africa, which means the line between ancient primitive humans and our own species might be far blurrier and far more recent than most people are comfortable admitting. What you're about to hear next was, for a long time, deliberately left out of mainstream history books, because it complicates the tidy narrative of human progress that most of us grew up with. For most of the 20th century, the story taught in classrooms was simple: ape, then early hominid, then a straight, clean line up to modern humans, like a single ladder climbing toward us as an inevitable end goal. But that's not evolution. That's mythology dressed up as science. The real picture looks less like a ladder and more like a bush, with dozens of branches sprouting off in different directions, most of them eventually snapping off and dying out. We didn't climb a staircase to get here. We're the last surviving twig on a tree that used to have far more branches. And some of those branches lasted an almost unbelievable amount of time before disappearing. Homo erectus is the longest surviving human species we know of, full stop. Not Homo sapiens, not Neanderthals. Homo erectus. They emerged roughly 2 million years ago, and some populations may have survived until as recently as 100,000 years ago, meaning the single species existed for close to 2 million years. For comparison, Homo sapiens, us, has only been around for roughly 300,000 years. If Homo erectus were still here, we'd be the newcomers, the fresh-faced upstarts who just showed up a few minutes ago on their timeline. Homo erectus were the first humans to control fire in a consistent, reliable way. The first to migrate out of Africa in massive waves, reaching as far as Indonesia and China. The first to build boats capable of crossing open water, based on evidence that they somehow reached islands that would have required deliberate sea voyages. Imagine standing on a beach 800,000 years ago, watching the horizon, and deciding to build something that could carry you across open ocean, with absolutely no idea what, if anything, was on the other side. And then, after surviving ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and nearly 2 million years of a constantly shifting planet, they vanish. Not in one dramatic event. In a slow fade, region by region, until the very last known population on the island of Java disappears sometime between 117,000 and 108,000 years ago. 2 million years of survival. Gone not with a bang, but a whisper so quiet we almost missed it in the fossil record entirely. Here's where psychology gets uncomfortable, and this is the third time you need to notice it. Every one of these disappearances follows a pattern that should feel eerily familiar to you, because you can see the exact same instincts playing out in modern human behavior every single day. When resources get scarce and groups tighten, outsiders get dehumanized, or in this case, quite literally not considered fully human at all. Competition escalates before cooperation is even considered as an option. You see it in ancient hominid turf wars over caves and hunting grounds. You see it in modern arguments over borders, jobs, and neighborhoods. The wiring hasn't changed nearly as much as we'd like to believe. We just traded spears for different kinds of weapons. Now, the final piece of this puzzle, Homo Luzonensis. discovered in 2019 in the Philippines. This species is known from a shockingly small collection of bones, a few teeth, a handful of finger and toe bones, barely enough to reconstruct a rough sketch of what they might have looked like. But what those bones reveal is bizarre. A strange mix of primitive and modern features, existing on an isolated island chain that required crossing open water to even reach, meaning this tiny, poorly understood species may have also achieved seafaring capabilities scientists once assumed were exclusive to advanced humans like us. An entire species, quietly existing on remote Philippine islands, possibly overlapping in time with early Homo sapiens migrations through Southeast Asia. And we know almost nothing about how they lived, how they died, or why they disappeared. Just fragments. Just whispers. Just enough to prove they existed, and not nearly enough to explain why they don't anymore. And this is where the story gets genuinely disturbing, because here's the darkest reveal the one scientists are still cautious about saying out loud in plain language. When you line up the disappearance dates of these different species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, the Flores Hobbits, Homo Naledi, Homo Erectus, Homo Luzonensis, there's an unsettling pattern. In almost every single case, the disappearance either directly coincides with or closely follows the arrival of Homo sapiens in that same region. Not climate change acting alone. Not volcanic eruptions acting alone. Us showing up, and then within a relatively short window of time, geologically speaking, the other species vanishing. That doesn't necessarily mean organized warfare, spears and ambushes, though there's likely some of that buried in the fossil record too. It might mean something slower and in some ways more disturbing. Simple, relentless competition. We were better at extracting calories from the same landscape, better at cooperating in larger groups, better at passing down complex information through language and symbolic thought. Every advantage we had, even small ones, compounded generation after generation until the other species simply couldn't keep pace, and their numbers quietly bled out over centuries. We didn't necessarily need to fight them to erase them. We just needed to outcompete them slowly, patiently, without ever fully realizing what we were doing. And there's a genetic detail that makes this even stranger. When scientists study the DNA of modern humans, they occasionally find fragments that don't match any known human species at all. Not Homo sapiens, not Neanderthal, not Denisovan. Ghost lineages, scientists call them. Genetic evidence of entire human populations that once existed, once interbred with our ancestors, and then disappeared so completely that we don't have a single bone, a single tooth, a single physical trace of them left. The only proof they ever existed is a strange signature buried in your own genome, whispering that there were even more of the other 6 than we've ever been able to name. Think about that. There may be entire branches of the human family tree that vanish so completely, we'll never even know their names. We'll never see their faces. The only reason we know they existed at all is because some of them had children with our direct ancestors, tens of thousands of years ago, and those genetic fingerprints never fully washed out. So here's the uncomfortable question this whole story leaves you with. We like to think of ourselves as the end point of evolution, the inevitable winners, the smart ones who made it. But the truth is far less flattering and far more human in the worst sense of that word. We survived, at least in part, because we were relentlessly, efficiently good at outcompeting anything that stood between us and the same limited resources everyone needed to live. That instinct didn't disappear when the last Neanderthal died out, or when the last Hobbit vanished from Flores, or when the final Homo erectus took their last breath on a Javanese riverbank. It's still running in the background of every human brain alive today. Every time a group draws a hard line between us and them, every time resources get tight, and empathy quietly gets rationed along with everything else. You're not just descended from the survivors of that ancient world. In a very real sense, some of you are also descended from the ones who disappeared, folded quietly into your bloodline through unions history never bothered to record. The next time you look in the mirror, you're not just looking at Homo sapiens. Depending on where your ancestors came from, you might be looking at the last living trace of a Neanderthal, a Denisovan, or some ghost species we don't even have a name for yet. We didn't just survive the other 6. In a strange, quiet way, some of us became them. And maybe that's the real ending nobody tells you in school. Extinction isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's just a species learning to live inside a different one heartbeat at a time, all the way down to now.